Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we dive deep into stories that touch your heart and challenge the way you see the world. Today, we have an emotional and thought-provoking tale that explores family, identity, and the power of second chances. In this story, a white billionaire crosses paths with a homeless man who bears an uncanny resemblance to him. What starts as a brief encounter turns into a life-changing discovery when the billionaire realizes this man is more than just a stranger. He's the son he never knew he had. Together, they embark on a journey of healing, redemption, and rebuilding their lost bond, proving that sometimes the most unexpected connections can change everything. If stories of transformation and hope inspire you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest episode. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what you think of today's story. It was an early Monday morning, and the city streets were bustling with people rushing to their destinations. Expensive cars lined the streets, their drivers caught up in the fast pace of urban life. Among them was Samuel Harrison, a billionaire real estate mogul known for his ruthless business acumen and his lavish lifestyle. He was on his way to an important meeting, sitting comfortably in the back seat of his luxury sedan, scrolling through emails on his phone. His driver, Michael, navigated the morning traffic with precision, weaving through the congested streets of downtown. As they approached the stoplight, Samuel glanced out the window, briefly observing the usual scene of pedestrians, street vendors, and the occasional panhandler. It was nothing new to him. His life had long since detached from the struggles of everyday people. But as they came to a stop, something caught his eye. A homeless man sitting on the corner with a cardboard sign. The man's clothes were ragged, and his face was weathered with the harshness of life on the streets. Yet, there was something about him that made Samuel look twice. It wasn't just the desperation in his eyes or the way he clutched the sign that read, "Anything helps." No, it was something deeper, a strange familiarity. Without thinking, Samuel rolled down his window and called out to the man, "Hey, come here for a second." The homeless man hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether Samuel was talking to him. But as their eyes met, something shifted. He slowly got up and approached the car. "Here," Samuel said, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a couple of $100 bills. He handed the money through the window, his gaze still locked on the man. "Thank you," the man muttered, his voice hoarse from lack of use. He took the money but didn't walk away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning Samuel's face as if trying to place him. It was then that Samuel felt it too, their faces, their features. The man standing in front of him bore an uncanny resemblance to him. It was as if he were staring into a mirror, but one that reflected a life he had never lived, a life of hardship and suffering. "What's your name?" Samuel asked, his voice unusually soft. "David," the man replied, his eyes filled with confusion and suspicion. "David Cole." The name meant nothing to Samuel, yet the resemblance haunted him. He felt compelled to know more, to dig deeper, but the light turned green, and the car behind them honked impatiently. "I need to go," Samuel said, pulling out his business card. "Call me. We need to talk." David looked down at the card, his expression unreadable. Before he could say anything, Michael began to drive off, leaving David standing on the sidewalk, clutching both the money and the card. As they pulled away, Samuel leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Who was this man, and why did he look so much like him? He couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting was more than just a coincidence. Something about it felt inevitable. "Michael, cancel the rest of my morning meetings," Samuel instructed his driver suddenly, his mind still processing the encounter. Michael glanced at him in the rearview mirror, clearly surprised. "Are you sure, sir?" "Yes," Samuel said, his voice firm. "I need some time to think." As they sped away from the busy downtown streets, Samuel couldn't help but wonder if he had just stumbled upon a piece of his past that he had long forgotten, or perhaps a piece he had never known existed. The encounter with David lingered in Samuel's mind for days. He tried to focus on his work, attending meetings and making deals, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the homeless man on the corner. The resemblance between them was too strong to ignore, and something inside him told him that their paths were meant to cross. It wasn't long before Samuel received a phone call. The number was unlisted, but he answered anyway, his gut telling him it was David. "Is this Samuel?" a hesitant voice asked. "Yes, this is Samuel," he replied, his heart racing. "David?" "Yeah, it's me," David said, his voice shaky. "I got your card. I wasn't sure if I should call, but I don't know, man. You said we should talk." "Thank you for calling," Samuel said, relieved. "Can you meet me at my office tomorrow? I think we need to have a conversation." "Your office?" David repeated, clearly uncertain. "I don't know, man. I'm not exactly dressed for that." "Don't worry about that," Samuel assured him. "I just want to talk." After a pause, David agreed, and Samuel gave him the address. The next day, as Samuel sat in his sleek, glass-walled office, he found himself staring out the window, waiting for David to arrive. His mind was filled with questions, but most of all, he needed to know why they looked so alike. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Karen, peeked her head in. "Mr. Cole is here to see you." "Send him in," Samuel said, standing up and adjusting his suit. The door opened, and David walked in, looking out of place in his torn jacket and worn-out shoes. He shifted uncomfortably as he stood in the polished office, clearly feeling like he didn't belong. Samuel motioned for him to sit. "Thank you for coming." David sat down, his eyes scanning the opulence around him. "This is a nice place," he said quietly. "It wasn't always like this," Samuel admitted. "I grew up with very little, but that's not why we're here. David, I have to ask, do you know why we look so much alike?" David looked down at his hands, avoiding eye contact. "I don't know, man. I've never seen you before in my life." Samuel leaned forward, studying David's face. "I think there's more to this. Do you know anything about your parents, your family?" David sighed deeply. "I don't know much. My mom, she died when I was born. I never knew my dad. I grew up in foster care, bouncing around from one home to another." Samuel's chest tightened. "Your mom, did she ever tell anyone about your father? Anything at all?" David shook his head. "All I know is that my mom was young when she had me, and no one ever talked about my dad. He was just gone." Samuel felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was one he never expected. "David," Samuel said, his voice heavy with emotion, I think I might be your father." David's eyes widened in shock, his breath catching in his throat. "What? No, that's impossible." "I don't think it is," Samuel replied, his voice shaking slightly. "There's a lot we need to figure out, but I think you might be my son." The room fell silent as the weight of Samuel's words hung in the air. David stared at him, his mind racing, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. "Why now?" David finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you telling me this now?" Samuel looked down at his hands, the guilt of his past mistakes pressing down on him. "Because I didn't know," he admitted. "I didn't know about you. But now that I do, I want to make it right." David's eyes filled with tears, a mix of anger, confusion, and hope swirling inside him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't alone. The realization weighed heavily on both Samuel and David. In the silence that followed, both men were grappling with emotions neither had ever expected to face. Samuel, the powerful billionaire, was now a father to a man whose life he had unknowingly neglected, while David, a man who had spent his life on the streets, was suddenly staring at the man who should have been there for him from the start. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between the walls of the opulent office and Samuel's face. "So, what now? You find out you have a son, and you just, what, give me some cash to make up for it?" Samuel leaned forward, his eyes full of regret. "David, it's not like that. I didn't know. I had no idea I had no idea she was pregnant." "You didn't know because you didn't care enough to stay," David shot back, his voice tinged with anger. "You left her, you moved on, and she died giving birth to me alone." Samuel flinched at the harsh truth, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. I know I made mistakes. I was young, ambitious, and I made choices I regret now. But you have to understand, David. I had no way of knowing." David's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away, unwilling to show vulnerability. "I spent my whole life wondering who my father was. In and out of foster homes, nobody cared. Nobody looked out for me. And now you want to play Father of the Year because you feel guilty?" Samuel's heart broke at the pain in David's voice. He stood up and walked to the large glass window overlooking the city, staring out at the skyline. "I can't change the past. I wish I could. But what I can do is be here for you now. I want to help you, David. I want to make sure you don't have to struggle anymore." David remained silent, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The anger in him was real, but so was the sense of longing. For the first time in his life, someone was offering him something more than just survival. His father was offering him a chance to rebuild the life he never had. After a long pause, David finally spoke. "What do you want from me?" Samuel turned back to him, his eyes full of sincerity. "I don't want anything from you. I just want to get to know you. I want to help you get back on your feet." David scoffed. "And what, I'm supposed to just trust you? You're the guy who wasn't there when I needed you." "I know I wasn't," Samuel admitted, "but I'm here now. Please let me help you." The room fell silent again, the weight of the past pressing down on them both. David stood up, looking around the office one last time before his gaze settled on Samuel. "I don't need your charity," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe we can talk. Maybe." Samuel nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, David. That's all I ask." They exchanged few more words that day, but it was clear that the wall between them, though not yet fully broken down, had at least begun to crack. Over the following weeks, Samuel and David met regularly. Their conversations were strained at first, both of them treading carefully around the pain and anger that had defined David's life for so long. But as time went on, they began to open up to each other. Samuel took David to lunch at his favorite restaurant, a high-end establishment where the waitstaff knew him by name. David, feeling out of place in his second-hand clothes, shifted uncomfortably in the sleek leather booth, looking around at the polished crowd. "You don't have to do this," David said, eyeing the menu with its exorbitant prices. "I'm not some charity case." Samuel set down his fork and looked at his son. "This isn't about charity, David. This is about us getting to know each other. You're my son, and I want to spend time with you." David looked away, still not fully convinced. He had been on his own for so long, it was hard to accept someone's help, even his own father's. But something inside him softened as Samuel continued to talk, sharing stories about his past, his early struggles, and the decisions that led to his success. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," Samuel said with a small smile. "I didn't grow up with money. Everything I have now I worked for, but I had people who helped me along the way. I want to be that person for you." David listened quietly, surprised by the vulnerability in Samuel's words. For the first time, he saw his father not as some untouchable billionaire, but as a man who had fought his way to the top, and who now wanted to help him do the same. "I don't even know where to start," David admitted, his voice low. "I've been on the streets for so long, I don't even know what a normal life looks like." "That's why I'm here," Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to figure it all out on your own. We'll take it one step at a time. I'll help you get a place to stay, a job, whatever you need." David looked down at his hands, the weight of his past still heavy on his shoulders. "I don't want to be a burden," he said quietly. "You're not a burden," Samuel replied, his tone insistent. "You're my son." For the first time, those words didn't sound strange to David. They didn't feel like a lie. Maybe, just maybe, he could believe them. In the weeks that followed, Samuel kept his promise. He helped David find a small apartment in a decent part of town, and he pulled some strings to get him a job at one of his companies. Not as a favor, but because he believed in David's potential. At first, David was hesitant. The idea of working in an office, wearing a suit, and following a routine was foreign to him after years of living on the streets. But with Samuel's guidance, he slowly began to adapt. The office was intimidating at first, an open-floor workspace filled with well-dressed professionals tapping away at computers and attending meetings. David, with his worn-out clothes and uncertain demeanor, felt out of place. But Samuel made sure to introduce him to the team, reassuring him that he belonged there just as much as anyone else. "You'll start small," Samuel had told him, "but if you put in the work, you'll move up. I see a lot of potential in you, David." David had doubted it at first, but as the weeks went on, he found himself learning more about the business world than he ever thought possible. Samuel didn't hold his hand. He made sure David earned his place, but he was always there to offer advice and encouragement when needed. And slowly, David began to feel like he was rebuilding his life, piece by piece. One evening, after a long day at the office, David and Samuel sat down in Samuel's study, a cozy room lined with bookshelves and family photos. The warmth of the room contrasted with the coldness of the sterile offices and the even colder nights David used to spend on the streets. "How do you feel?" Samuel asked, pouring himself a glass of scotch and offering one to David. David shook his head, declining the drink. "It's weird," he admitted. "I spent so long thinking I'd never get out of that hole. Now it's like, I don't know, like I have a future again." Samuel smiled, the pride evident in his eyes. "You do have a future, David, and it's a bright one." David looked at the older man, the father he had never known until now, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel something he had pushed down for so long: hope. As the months passed, the relationship between Samuel and David deepened. They still had their differences, David's street-hardened toughness clashing with Samuel's refined business demeanor, but they learned to navigate their new roles as father and son. David's career at Samuel's company began to take off. He worked hard, determined to prove to himself and to Samuel that he wasn't just there because of family connections. He wanted to earn his place, to build a life he could be proud of. One day, after a long day at the office, Samuel invited David to dinner at his home. It was the first time David would meet the rest of the family, including Samuel's wife and children from his second marriage. David was nervous as he stepped into the sprawling mansion, his hands sweating slightly as he shook hands with Samuel's wife, Julia, and exchanged pleasantries with his half-siblings. The dinner was awkward at first. David wasn't used to the formality, the polished conversations, but by the end of the night, he felt more at ease, laughing at old family stories and realizing that maybe, just maybe, he had a place in this new life. As they said their goodbyes, Samuel pulled David aside. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've come a long way, David, and I'm honored to call you my son." David smiled, the weight of his past finally beginning to lift. "I never thought I'd have a family," he admitted, his voice soft. "But I guess I was wrong." Samuel nodded, his eyes glistening. "We're family, David, and we always will be." As David continued to thrive in his new life, he never forgot where he came from. The streets had shaped him, taught him hard lessons, and he knew that there were still countless others out there struggling to survive just like he had. With Samuel's help, David began working on a new project, an outreach program aimed at helping homeless youth. They partnered with local shelters, offering job training, mentorship, and housing assistance to those in need. For David, it was a way to give back, to help others find the same second chance he had been given. The program quickly gained momentum, and soon, David found himself in the spotlight. Local news outlets covered the initiative, and word spread about the man who had once lived on the streets and was now helping others rebuild their lives. At one of the program's launch events, David stood before a crowd of young people, his heart pounding as he prepared to speak. He wasn't used to public speaking, but he knew this was important. "I know what it's like to feel like the world has forgotten about you," he began, his voice steady. "I know what it's like to think you'll never get out of the hole you're in, but I'm here to tell you that it's possible. With hard work, determination, and the right support, you can turn your life around." The crowd erupted into applause, and David felt a surge of pride and purpose. He had come a long way from the boy who had grown up on the streets, and now he was determined to help others do the same. Years passed, and David's life continued to flourish. His outreach program expanded, helping hundreds of young people escape the cycle of homelessness and poverty. He and Samuel remained close, their bond stronger than ever. One evening, as they sat together in Samuel's study, reflecting on how far they had come, Samuel looked at David with a smile. "You've built something incredible, David. You've changed lives." David shrugged, though he couldn't hide the pride in his eyes. "I had a lot of help. From you." Samuel shook his head. "You did this, David. You took control of your life, and now you're helping others do the same. That's your legacy." David looked at his father, the man who had once been a stranger, and smiled. "Maybe," he said softly. "But I think we built this legacy together." Samuel nodded, his heart full. "Together," he agreed. And as they sat in the quiet of the evening, the weight of the past finally lifted, replaced by the promise of a future built on love, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between father and son. Thank you for joining us on this profound journey of discovery, forgiveness, and family. This story reminds us that sometimes life's most unexpected moments can lead us back to what truly matters: connection, compassion, and love. The bond that formed between the billionaire and his long-lost son shows us that no matter how far apart life may take us, it's never too late to build a new path forward. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of family and second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to Hopeful Horizon for more inspiring and heartwarming stories that touch the soul. And remember, sometimes the people who shape us the most are the ones we least expect. Stay hopeful.